Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on, well, the biological structure that makes us who we are, the nervous system.
And we're not talking about a simple switchboard here. I mean, we are diving into a network with an estimated 100 billion neurons.
100 billion.
And an absolutely staggering 100 trillion connections. The goal is to figure out how that immense scale translates into everything from a muscle twitch to consciousness itself.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize the key concepts of how this system is organized. You know, how these cells manage everything from basic reflex arcs right up to memory.
It's all about understanding how the map of the brain equals the function of the mind.
So where do you even start with a map that complex?
Well, to appreciate the challenge, think about how scientists even trace these pathways. For a long time, it was like looking into a bowl of gray spaghetti.
Right.
But then researchers studying mice developed a technique called the brainbow. They genetically engineered neurons to express a random mix of fluorescent proteins.
A brainbow. And what does that actually do?
It creates this map of just staggering detail. Each neuron, or maybe a small cluster of them, lights up in one of the 90 different color combinations.
Wow.
So scientists can literally trace individual wires, these distinct pathways, across the brain without them all just blurring together. It's a revolutionary way to start reading that 100 trillion connection map.
That really puts the complexity into perspective immediately.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the fundamental circuits and trace the organization up from simpler animals.
If we look across evolution, the most basic systems, like in hydras, have a diffuse, kind of disorganized nerve net.
Just a net of cells.
Exactly. But a huge shift happens as animals evolve bilateral symmetry. We start to see this trend of cephalization.
Which is the clustering of neurons at the front end.
Right, the anterior end. It creates a centralized control center, which, we recognize as a brain.
And when we jump to vertebrates, like us, that organization gets very strictly segregated into two main parts. You have the central nervous system, the CNS.
The brain and spinal cord, the integration hub.
And then everything else is the peripheral nervous system, the PNS.
Right, and that's the crucial transport system. The nerves, the ganglia. It's all about handling that two-way transfer of information. Sensory input in to the CNS, motor commands out to the body.
So the CNS itself, it's highly protected, right? It's not just sitting there.
Oh, absolutely. The whole system is basically suspended in a liquid cushion.
That would be the cerebrospinal fluid.
Exactly. It fills those hollow spaces, the ventricles in the brain, the central canal, and the spinal cord. And this fluid is critical. It's filtered from blood, so it's applying nutrients, carrying away waste. It keeps the whole environment perfectly stable.
And when you look at the tissue, we always hear about gray matter and white matter.
We do. And it's a simple distinction, really. Gray matter is where the action happens. It's mostly the neuron cell bodies and dendrites.
The processing center.
The processing centers. White matter, on the other hand, is the bundled axons, usually myelinated. Think of it like high-speed fiber optic cables. But their arrangement is different. In the spinal cord, white matter is on the outside for quick links to the PNS. In the brain, though, it's mostly interior, handling all that massive internal signaling for cognition and memory.
So if the CNS is the integrator, does the spinal cord ever act on its own without the brain's input?
Absolutely. That is the very definition of a reflex. The classic example is, of course, the knee-jerk reflex. It's a perfect demonstration of the spinal cord's autonomy for rapid, involuntary responses.
Okay, walk us through it. The doctor taps that tendon just below your kneecap. What happens?
So sensors in your quadriceps muscle detect that stretch. Sensory neurons then fire a signal straight to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, motor neurons are immediately activated, causing the quadriceps to contract. Your leg kicks. But here's the really clever part. The integration.
Right.
At the exact same time, interneurons in the spinal cord inhibit the motor neurons that go to the opposing muscle, your hamstring.
So you contract one and relax the other instantly.
Instantly. It's all to maintain balance. And this all happens before the signal even reaches your conscious brain.
That coordination is just incredible. Okay, so let's look at the PNS's output side, the efferent side. That splits into two major branches.
Right. First, you have the motor system. This controls your skeletal muscles. It's what lets you voluntarily raise your hand, but it also carries out those involuntary reflexes we just talked about.
And the second one?
The autonomic nervous system. This is generally involuntary. It regulates your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. Think heart rate, digestion, things like that.
The autonomic system is fascinating because it's functionally antagonistic. It's like having a biological gas pedal and a brake.
That's a perfect analogy. The sympathetic division is the gas pedal. It's all about arousal, energy, fight or flight.
Right, so it accelerates your heart, slows down digestion.
Exactly. It stimulates glucose release for immediate energy. Then, conversely, the parasympathetic division is the brake. Calming, self-maintenance, rest, and digest.
Slows the heart, gets digestion going again.
Precisely. And the reason they can have these opposing effects is partly down to their neurotransmitters. Sympathetic neurons mostly use norepinephrine, while parasympathetic neurons use acetylcholine.
We can't talk about circuits without mentioning the support crew, the glia. They're not just, packing peanuts, are they?
Far from it. No, they are absolutely vital. They regulate, they protect. For instance, you have oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. They're the myelin makers.
One for the CNS, one for the PNS.
Right. They ensure signals travel fast. Then you have astrocytes, which form the crucial blood-brain barrier, basically acting as bouncers, regulating what gets into the CNS from the blood.
And you mentioned they also play a role in development.
Yeah, radioglia are like guides. They form a scaffold that helps migrating neurons find their final destinations in the developing brain.
Okay, so with that basic architecture understood, we can get to the specialized regions of the vertebrate brain. We tend to organize it by its evolutionary history, right?
Yeah.
The forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain.
And that structure tells a real evolutionary story. If you compare, say, a fish to a mammal, the relative size of these regions tells you what's functionally important for that animal.
How so?
Well, a ray-finned fish has a large midbrain because vision and input from its lateral line are critical for survival. But in mammals and birds, as cognition becomes more complex, the forebrain just explodes in size.
So let's walk through the major structures in the adult human brain, starting at the very core, the brainstem.
The brainstem is made of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The medulla is just essential. It controls all those vital homeostatic functions, breathing, heart rate, swallowing all automatically.
It's the survival center.
It is. And it's also where most motor axons cross over. That amazing fact that your right brain controls the left side of your body, that wiring happens right there in the medulla.
Okay, right next door is the cerebellum. We usually think of it for coordination, but you're saying it's more of an error checker.
Precisely. It coordinates movement and balance by constantly monitoring and correcting motor output. If your cerebellum is damaged, simple tasks become impossible. Your hand might overshoot a target because that error checking is gone.
Moving up from there, we get to the diencephalon. This contains the thalamus.
The thalamus is like the brain's air traffic controller for sensory information.
I like that.
Almost all sensory input, except for smell, gets sorted there and then routed to the correct part of the cerebrum for processing. And right below it, you have the tiny but incredibly powerful hypothalamus.
The master regulator.
The master regulator for homeostasis, body temp, hunger, thirst, and it's also our central biological clock.
And finally, we get to the big one, that massive wrinkled cap, the cerebrum.
Right. Divided into two hemispheres, and it's the center for, well, everything we think of as us. Learning, emotion, memory, perception, and voluntary muscle control.
And the cerebrum manages our cycles of arousal and sleep.
It does. And it's important to know that sleep isn't a passive state. It's very active, with specific electrical patterns you can see on an EEG.
And dolphins have that incredible adaptation.
They do. The EEG confirms it. They sleep with one hemisphere at a time. It allows them to keep swimming, keep surfacing for air continuously.
You mentioned the biological clock. The coordination of these cycles are circadian rhythms. That's the job of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, right?
That's our master timekeeper, located in the hypothalamus. It synchronizes our internal clock with the outside world, mainly using light cues from the eyes to know when it's day and when it's night.
Speaking of internal states, let's talk about emotions. These are deeply connected to the limbic system.
Right, a group of structures that border the brainstem, including the amygdala and hippocampus. And the amygdala in particular is our emotional processing hub. It's vital for storing emotional memories.
There are studies on this, right?
Oh, yes. If a subject has a damaged amygdala, they can tell you about a frightening event. The explicit memory is there, but they lose the physical automatic response, the pounding heart, the adrenaline, the emotional charge is gone.
And this brings up a great point about how we even study these things in a living brain. Functional MRI, or fMRI, has been a real game changer.
It truly has. fMRI tracks the flow of oxygen-rich blood, which tells you which neurons are working the hardest. A great study used it to map emotional responses to music.
What did they find?
When subjects listened to sad music, activity shot up in the amygdala, But happy music, that lit up the nucleus accumbens, which is famously known as the brain's pleasure center. So you see these specialized regions handling very different feelings.
That brings us to the star of the show, the cerebral cortex. The outer layer, vital for language, memory, consciousness. We divide it into 4 lobes.
The frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes. And the cortex itself has this incredible organization map. The somatosensory cortex for touch and the motor cortex for movement. They aren't mapped by body size.
But by functional necessity.
Exactly. The amount of cortical real estate dedicated to the hands and face is just massive because of the fine motor control and sensory feedback we need from those areas.
We see even finer specialization with language processing. There are 2 very famous regions.
Indeed. Broca's area in the left frontal lobe is essential for forming speech. If it's damaged, a person can understand language perfectly, but they struggle to produce fluid, coherent words.
And the inverse of that is Wernicke's area.
Right, in the left temporal lobe. It's essential for comprehending language. Damage there means a person might speak fluently, but it's often nonsensical, and they can't understand what's being said to them.
This specialization is part of lateralization, the idea that the 2 hemispheres have different jobs.
Generally, yes. The left hemisphere tends to dominate in logic, math, and language. The right is better at nonverbal things like recognizing faces or patterns.
And this is most dramatically shown in the split brain patients.
Right. If the corpus callosum, that huge bundle of fibers connecting the hemispheres, is cut, the 2 sides work independently. If you show an object to their left field of vision, the image goes to the right brain.
Which doesn't have the language center.
Exactly. So they cannot name the object, even though they might be able to draw it with their left hand. It's fascinating.
And we can't discuss the frontal lobe without mentioning Phineas Gage.
The foundational case in modern neuroscience. The iron rod went through his left frontal lobe. He survived, but his personality was completely different. He became erratic, profane, unable to plan.
So is the first real proof that the prefrontal cortex is the seat of our executive functions.
Temperament, decision-making, social conduct. It's the part of your brain that's planning your day or telling you not to eat that second piece of cake.
Now, for years, the assumption was that you needed that big folded mammalian cortex for higher cognition. But birds have challenged that.
They really have. Crows, scrub jays. They show complex behaviors like tool use and abstract thought, and they do it with a completely different brain structure, not a layered cortex, but clustered nuclei in a region called the pallium.
So evolution found 2 different ways to build a smart brain.
2 separate, structurally distinct routes to complex intelligence. It's remarkable.
Okay, let's shift from fixed organization to adaptive change. How the system remodels itself, which is the basis for memory and learning.
Well, the creation of the adult network is a very selective process. During development, about half the neurons that are formed are eliminated. Then comes synaptic pruning, where over half of the initial synapses are removed.
So it's sculpting the brain.
It's sculpting the optimal network for that individual's environment. But even the adult system isn't static. It has neuronal plasticity.
The capacity to be remodeled based on activity.
Right. Adding, losing, strengthening, or weakening connections. We know how critical this is because disruptions in plasticity are strongly linked to conditions like autism spectrum disorder.
And plasticity is the mechanism of memory. We have short-term memory,
which uses temporary links in the hippocampus, and then long-term memory, where those links are consolidated and replaced by permanent structural changes in the cerebral cortex.
And that's why damage to the hippocampus stops you from forming new long-term memories, but your old ones are safe.
Exactly, because they're already stored in the cortex. Now, the molecular mechanism that makes this possible is long-term potentiation, or LTP.
The physical basis of learning.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. How does a connection actually get stronger?
It's really elegant. LTP requires 2 things to happen at once. First, you need a rapid burst of signals from the presynaptic neuron.
A lot of activity.
A lot of activity. And at the same time, the postsynaptic cell has to be depolarized by other inputs. When both those things happen, a special receptor called the NMDA receptor gets unblocked.
What's blocking it?
A magnesium ion. When it's pushed out, glutamate can activate the receptor, and that allows calcium ions to flood into the cell.
And the calcium is the trigger.
The calcium is the trigger. That influx signals the cell to insert more of another receptor, AMPA receptors, into the membrane. More AMPA receptors means that synapse is now stronger, more sensitive. That change is the physical trace of a memory.
Moving from learning to dysfunction, we have to touch on nervous system disorders. They're a mix of genetic and environmental factors, right?
A very complex mix. Take schizophrenia. It affects about 1% of people, has a strong genetic link, and the leading hypothesis is that it involves disrupted pathways that use dopamine. That's supported by how dopamine-blocking drugs can be an effective treatment.
And then mood disorders, like major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder.
Right, and their treatments often aim to increase the activity of other biogenic amines, like serotonin.
We should also mention drug addiction.
A devastating disorder. Addictive drugs essentially hijack the brain's reward system. It's a dopamine pathway that runs from the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, to the nucleus accumbens. By flooding that system with dopamine, the drugs create long-lasting changes that drive craving and dependence.
Finally, the age-related neurodegenerative disorders. Alzheimer's disease.
A form of dementia characterized by memory loss. The hallmarks in the brain are amyloid plaques protein clumps outside the neurons and neurofibrillary tangles of tau protein inside them.
And contrast that with Parkinson's disease.
Parkinson's is primarily a motor disorder, tremors, poor balance, and it's caused by the death of dopamine-secreting neurons in the midbrain. The common treatment, L-DOPA, is a precursor to dopamine that can actually cross the blood-brain barrier.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground, from 100 trillion connections through brain regions all the way down to the molecular basis of memory with LTP.
What's truly amazing when you synthesize it all is the brain's duality. It has this fixed, fundamental organization from development, but it also retains this remarkable plasticity. This ability to change and remodel itself throughout life means this complex machine is never truly finished building itself.
So as you go about your day, what does all this mean for you?
I'd say consider the scope of something like the U.S. government's BRAIN initiative. The goal isn't just to map the circuits, it's to figure out how the activity buzzing through those 100 trillion connections translates into actual thought and perception and behavior.
The leap from electricity to consciousness.
That is the ultimate frontier in science.
The frontier we are all a part of. Thank you for diving deep with us today.